Okay, here we are again. As I said, here we are again. The people who came. A couple of things. As some of you in the class may know, there's this early academic alert system that's out there that your professors contribute to, designed to keep you guys abreast of where you are performing academically. I placed you all on triple secret academic probation, but just they wouldn't let me enter it, so otherwise. Do check it, though, because they ask professors to leave little pieces of advice as to what you might do better and what you might focus on. I didn't have too many things I needed to worry about, fortunately. All right, but do take it seriously. Everyone know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Some of you may, if you're especially if it's your first year here. Okay. Last time we talked about the First World War and the impact the First World War and how people thought about war, the impact it had on the way in which people would react to the prospect of war in the 1920s and the 1930s, the way in which the war continued and really sort of accelerated the breakdown of the distinction between a civilian and a combatant. What I want to start talking about today is some of the aftermath of the war. That is, as I said at the start of the talk the other day, 1914, to many historians, represents the real break between what we might call sort of the long 19th century and the 20th century. That the elements of 20th century history that we sort of recall, the things that when we think about the 20th century, we go back to or refer back to immediately, almost all of those are products of the post-1914 world. And I want to start talking today about one significant one that's going to have an enormous impact on the 20th century. And that is the fact that the First World War brings an end to the absolutist rule of the aristocratic regime in Russia. The rule of the Tsar ends directly because of the First World War. Yes?
We'll be talking about Lenin.
Yes. We will be talking about Lenin, this guy, very shortly. But just to give it sort of a larger thematic sensibility, or sense, we're going to be talking about how the First World War is this circumstance that sort of finally pushes Russia over the edge. And we'll talk about the way in which the Soviet Union that emerges is in some ways enormously different from the Russia of pre-1917, or the Russia before 1917. But on the other hand, the Soviet Union, for all its new name, new practices economically, new emphasis on the rise of sort of class distinction, or the elimination of class distinctions, the new Soviet Union will in some ways, rather ironically, resemble the old regime in Russia, the Tsarist regime in Russia. That is, the revolution in some ways is very radical, but in other ways, contained within it are elements that are going to ensure that Russian people are governed in somewhat the same way before and after 1917. Okay, so therefore I want to talk about the Russian Revolution in a little bit of detail and talk about in particular the way in which this man, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, conceives of the revolution and the way in which he carries it out. That is, the way in which he structures. We talked already a little bit about Lenin's view of socialism and in which way he thought the socialist revolution should go or how the socialist revolution should arrive. We'll talk a little bit more about how that pertains particularly to the Russian case today. Start, though, with Tsarist Russia. When the great powers of Europe go to war in 1914, there is no great power less prepared to fight a long war, a war of production, as I termed it last time, a war of attrition, than the Russians. Yes, the Russians have more Russians than anyone else has of anyone else. But even that, in this war, is no longer a decided advantage. That is, in a war in which technology, the ability to produce munitions, the ability to produce military equipment, the ability to use things like advanced technologies like field artillery, where that is the most important, those are the most important things, then the Russians are at a disadvantage. Russia does not have the industrial infrastructure of a Germany or a Britain to produce massive amounts of war material. Russia does not have the transport infrastructure to move goods and troops simultaneously, or to move goods to the front and to domestic markets simultaneously. The Russians had really only embarked on a large-scale railway building campaign in the 1890s, when the French loaned them a lot of money to do it. So you don't have a highly developed industrial base, you don't have significant transport resources, and you have an army, a state really, led by aristocratic members of one family, the Romanov dynasty, and their cousins and their friends, many of whom have absolutely no idea what they're doing. Many of whom are very unskilled in the latest in military tactics, and absolutely unskilled in how to integrate new technologies into their military. It is in the Russian army that soldiers charging in a fixed position will at times be told, pick up a rifle that's out there. We don't have any more for you, but there's bound to be some out there. See all those dead people? Yes. And there's bound to be some guns and ammunition out there. By 1916, the end of 1916 in particular, it is apparent to many people in Russia that their government is no longer up to the task of governing, put simply. That is, there are several problems. In the first place, the army is ill-prepared, it's suffering massive losses. You have the failure of supplies to get to the army. You also have the fact that in Russia itself, you are beginning to see significant food shortages. It's not that the food crops are failing. Rather, there's no way to transport the crops if they're harvested, and because the Russian army demands so much manpower, you have a loss of labor in the countryside. Russian agriculture is very traditional, very, almost sort of backward compared to other European states at this time. You need a lot of labor to bring in the harvest, and you don't have as much with so many people off to war. So you have this situation where the Russian state seems incapable of doing anything right. The army's getting slaughtered, the army is ill-prepared and under-equipped, and people in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow are seeing enormous rises in the price of bread and other foodstuffs. There had been, since about the turn of the century, a growing tension within the Soviet Union between the people, not just the peasantry, but the Russian middle class, Russian educated, you might say sort of the intelligentsia, the professionals, lawyers and doctors, and the Tsarist regime. And the Tsar had attempted to make some political concessions, to allow for an assembly, to allow for some freedom of debate and of the press. But the Tsar had also continued to rely on his chief weapon of rule, which was repression through violence. After the defeat of Russia by Japan in 1905, the Russian army will put down significant demonstrations in places like St. Petersburg with force. In early 1917 in St. Petersburg, in February 1917, I should warn you now that the Russian calendar was not the same as the Western European calendar in 1917. It was based on an older style of calendar. Yes, this is sort of how, in some ways, strange Russia was at this point. So I'm going to talk about February and October for revolutions in 1917. Some books may talk about March and November. It's February and October by our calendar now. But it was March and November so don't get confused if you see March or November. Just simply substitute February and October and we'll be good. But in the early part, the early 2 months, the first 2 months, excuse me, of 1917, there are rising protests in the cities against bread prices. Protests that are joined by people whose sons and husbands and others are off with the army engaged in this futile effort against the Germans and the Austrians. And in early February 1917, these protests turned a bit violent. People are actually rioting in the streets, assaulting soldiers, throwing rocks and putting up barricades in the streets. And the Tsar decides to respond in the only way he knows how. This is Nicholas II, the last Tsar, the last Russian emperor. He orders his troops out into the street to open fire to repress these demonstrations. They do, on one day, on the first day that they're commanded to, these troops do go out and fire on these civilians. I think about 50 people are killed. But the troops don't like what they've been asked to do, because some of them will say, we've basically been asked to shoot at our mothers and our fathers and our sisters and our families. And the troops rebel when they're told to go do it again. They will turn on their own officers, in fact. Shoot some of their own officers, and join the protesters in the streets. That is, ultimately, when Nicholas II orders the army to repress these protests, the army decides against. That is, the rank and file, not necessarily the officer class, although a few of them will join these rebels. But by and large, the army refuses to carry out the Tsar's wishes once they realize exactly what they are and once they realize sort of the depth of the protest and who's actually doing these protests. That it's not sort of, fringe elements. This is everyday normal people out there in St. Petersburg who have had enough with this both repressive and highly irresponsible or inefficient regime. When the army, in essence, quits on the Tsar is done. Nicholas II has to abdicate. He has to give up the throne at the end of February 1917. Because without his army, without the ability to use military force to back up his rule, he has no power. He has no legitimacy. Nobody voted for him. What you have is a rather swift fall of this several hundred years old monarchy, largely because it's a monarchy that that relied entirely on force to govern. And force can disappear quickly, and that's what happens in February 1917 in Russia. And it leaves this enormous power vacuum in Russia. Some Russian aristocrats flee abroad, the Tsar and others stay in Russia, but he abdicates and leaves St. Petersburg. And no one's quite sure what to do next. Between March and October 1917, there's going to be a lot of political tumult, a lot of political excitement and controversy and conflict in the cities in Russia, in particular in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. There are going to be people emerging, representing sometimes new political parties, sometimes political parties that had been banned but are now sort of coming back into the light. And there's going to be no consensus on where Russia ought to go. There's going to be, at one point, at least 3 different types of socialists, or socialist parties, contending for power, as well as people who might want to restore the monarchy, people who don't want to restore the monarchy but do want to continue the war against the Germans, people who want to protect the Russian Orthodox Church and its place in society, people who want to get rid of the Russian Orthodox Church and its place in society. It is very unsettled. And not only is it unsettled in the cities, But it's also unsettled in the army. This is the other thing that I think that we have to really understand. Between March and October 1917, you've still got millions of Russian soldiers in camps, some in Russia, some out by the front. They basically stopped fighting. The Germans have decided to sort of, the Germans basically pull back and say, let's see exactly what happens here. In many of these places, the troops form what come to be called Soviets. S-O-V-I-E-T-S. Soviets. A Soviet is basically a small self-governing community which has a council of elected members or elected residents to govern. And the soldiers, in essence, begin to declare that they're governing themselves. Most of their officers flee. So you've got a lot of political unrest in the cities, and you've got a massive armed contingent. Many of them drawn not from the cities, but from the Russian peasantry, many of whom have experienced a significant degree of economic and political repression throughout their lives, and they begin to organize amongst themselves. There's no clear sense in the middle of 1917 where Russia's going to go. And that's where this guy, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, enters the picture. Yes, George?
Please spell his name.
Lenin?
Please spell his name.
Yeah, L-E-N-I-N, Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Now, Lenin comes from a fairly upper-class family, not an aristocratic family, but a fairly well-to-do family in Russia, but a family that had embraced political reform, so much so that his older brother had tried to kill the Tsar in 1889. That's how reform-minded they were. And his brother had been executed. Lenin, by the early 20th century, was in exile, where he published all of these pamphlets and articles and short books describing his vision of socialism, which we talked about, I think, a little bit, and describing his vision of how socialism ought to come about. That is, if you remember back when we talked about socialism, Lenin took a different view from Marx. Marx thought that socialism emerged sort of gradually. That is, capitalism, industrialization produced ultimately this working class, which would then have a revolution and assume control of the means of production. That's the basic Marxist layout there. Lenin said, it's never going to happen that way. Lenin said, I like the end point, but it's never going to happen if you're going to wait for it to happen gradually, or wait for the working classes to organize themselves. He said, it's never going to happen. People will be bought off by wages and consumerism and greed and party infighting, etc. Lenin had come up with the notion that you need to have the revolution first. In fact, have the revolution in a place which is not really industrialized. Have the revolution for the people, not necessarily by the people. A revolution led by a small group that would instruct and shape how the people acted and ultimately transform the state that way. At the end, you'd have an industrialized socialist state. Same endpoint Marx wanted to get to. But Lenin changes the order. Marx said you have to have industrialization, capitalism, and eventually the growth of a workers' consciousness, then revolution. Lenin says, no, it's never going to work that way. Lenin says, have the revolution first, then, in essence, build the industrial state. And you'll get to the same conclusion. The problem, of course, is that Lenin's model has built into it certain things. It has built into it this assumption that the people need to be led, that the revolution is nothing that will emerge from the people, but needs to be, in some senses, be imposed upon the people. That a small group needs to take charge. And that in throwing out sort of the Marxist formula, or the Marxist framework for how you get there, Lenin was saying basically, the ends justify the means. For Marx, the means are very important. For Lenin, He's saying, however or whatever it takes, you get to this particular end. So there are elements in there of sort of dictatorial control, elements of violence, a notion of a revolution that may last sort of indefinitely. Because the revolution isn't over until the industrialized socialist state is complete. And who knows when that's going to be. So Lenin is out in Europe, living in Switzerland, publishing his ideas. In the spring of 1917, the Germans actually go to Switzerland and put him, basically say to Lenin, we think you ought to go back to Russia. They get an agreement from Lenin. Lenin says, I'm going to go back. And if I can somehow get control in Russia, I will end the war with you. Basically, unilaterally. Russia will surrender and give you just about everything you want on your eastern frontiers. And for the Germans, this sounds great. So they put him on this special train, this secret train, that takes him back to Russia. And in May 1917, he's back in St. Petersburg.
Where did he go? He's coming back from where?
Switzerland. So he's in exile in Switzerland.
That was the second time he'd been exiled, right?
Yeah, that was his second exile, yes. Yeah, he'd been, I'm trying to remember exactly.
The first time he was exiled for participating in...
Well, it was his brother that was the first exile, I think. And then he comes back, and then he's exiled again, if I remember correctly. I think the second one, though, is... I can't remember, because his brother... He sticks around a little bit after his brother is executed, trying to kill the Tsar.
When he's in school, he joins the whatever parties that
Yep.
they're called. And they,
The Socialist Revolution.
yeah. And they see his inclusion as a threat, so they give him a warning and they exile him to, I want to say Siberia.
Yeah, he has what's called internal exile, which the Tsar did, as well as the Soviets.
And then he comes back and he continues that, and then he gets exiled to Switzerland.
Yes. So he's got the internal and the external, yes. Yeah, he's got one inside Russia, one outside Russia. So Lenin comes back. Lenin is, at this point, fairly well known in Russia, or at least in Russian political circles. Lenin is the leader of a group which calls themselves the Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks, or Bolsheviki in Russian, which means the majority. It doesn't actually mean the majority of all Russians. It's actually a name that came out of a dispute within this Russian socialist group in the 1890s, where Lenin's group won the majority in his vote on how they would proceed. So they took the name the Bolsheviks. The people who lost, people who had different ideas about socialism would go, don't remember this part, but they wound up being called the minority, the Mensheviks, which is a terrible thing because it's hard to mount a national campaign when your name is the minority. It's easy to mount a national campaign when your name is the majority. And so the Bolsheviks, from the start, I think understood, and Lenin understood, it's the importance of what sort of title you claim for yourself in how you're going to make yourself appealing to people. But he comes back in May 1917. This, by the way, this is after Lenin's death. This is a poster for the 1930s in the Soviet Union. But it says, Lenin has lived, Lenin lives, Lenin will live. So Lenin is in some ways this sort of messiah figure who will live on perpetually as the founder of the revolution and the guiding light of the revolution, and whose writings inform how the revolution will progress. And in fact, one of the most recent histories, and one of the most in-depth histories of the Russian Revolution, does talk about the fact that there is a remarkable consistency. The way in which Lenin lays out how the revolution will go forward and what sort of state the revolution will create is actually not very different from what happens over the 70-some-odd years of the Soviet Union. So you have a situation where Lenin is presented as, again, sort of the founding father, almost the sort of prophet of the Soviet Union, and his ideas continue to resonate throughout the entire history of the Soviet Union, at least up until Mikhail Gorbachev takes over the party, the Soviet Communist Party, in the middle of the 1980s. But Lenin's not the only one who comes back. Another one who comes back, a guy who's actually been in exile in New York, is this man, Leon Trotsky. Trotsky. Leon Trotsky, who's actually been living, I think, in the Bronx. But he comes back when all this political turmoil erupts in Russia. Because the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky in particular, see this as their opportunity. That at a time of enormous political chaos, the Bolsheviks can insert themselves, and because the Bolsheviks don't, remember, the Bolsheviks don't care about means, they just care about where they end up. And in a situation this fluid and this tumultuous, the Bolsheviks feel like they can take advantage. And the minute Lenin gets back, he proposes a Bolshevik platform. You know, he doesn't have hundreds of thousands of followers. You know, he's got a few hundred core people around him when he comes back in May 1917. But he espouses and he publicizes a 3-word slogan. This is going to be the Bolshevik platform, which will be addressed to the Russian people in the summer of 1917. And the platform is quite simply this: bread, land, peace. Bread, land, peace. And it's designed to appeal to all sorts of disaffected parts of Russian society. Bread, well, and they're all connected. Bread, elect the Bolsheviks, because there's going to be an election in the fall of 1917 to this new Russian legislature. Elect the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks will ensure that food prices stay affordable and that supplies of food reach markets. Land. One of the ways in which the Bolsheviks will do this is the Bolsheviks are going to redistribute or oversee the redistribution of land in the countryside. Not the state owning the land, although that's ultimately what will happen, or what's in the mind of people like Lenin, but rather, what Lenin comes back in 1917 is saying is that if you have seized land that you used to perhaps rent or work on for an aristocratic landowner, during 1917, when a lot of these aristocrats flee Russia, a lot of the peasants take over the land. Peasants who have been renting or been sort of tenant farmers on farms or certain parts of larger estates, they then take it over and claim it as themselves, or claim it for themselves. And what the Bolsheviks are promising is, you can keep the land. You keep the land, you'll make it more productive, that'll help us ensure that we have bread. And finally the Bolsheviks say this, the Bolsheviks say, we will bring peace. In essence, they will bring peace at any price. For Lenin, the big thing will be to stop the war so that the project of remaking Russia can move on uninterrupted. Now, the important thing, I think, of all of these, bread, land, peace, is peace. Because in talking about peace and talking about his determination to end this conflict, Lenin is going to talk directly to the soldiers. Many of whom are out here in these self-proclaimed Soviets in military camps, near the front and in Russia itself. This is really hard to see, but if you see, the color doesn't come out very well here. But basically it's like this. In these green stars here refer to military bases, military camps. The little hammer and sickle Soviet sign here refers to where the Bolsheviks concentrate political activity in 1917. There is a lot of political activity located around various of these camps. Down here, especially as you get out to the front. Camps here, Soviet activity, Bolshevik activity here, Bolshevik activity here, Bolshevik activity here. Big one back in here at Ormsk, Bolshevik activity there. The Bolsheviks are focused on the army. And this is key to understanding Lenin's strategy. For Lenin, it's not necessarily about winning an election. Oh, that will help, he says. It's about, in essence, recruiting the military to his side. What the Bolsheviks want to do is the Bolsheviks are going to go to the polls, they're going to go to the elections in October 1917 with an insurance policy. If they don't win a majority, which which they won't, and they don't think they will, in the new Russian legislature, they'll be the only political party that has its own army, which will, shall we say, make the results of the election moot. So that's what the Bolsheviks are doing. They're out recruiting heavily, publicizing their platform heavily to the soldiers, who are sort of, basically running their own small communities, still have retained a lot of their arms. And in the summer and fall of 1917, especially under the leadership of Trotsky, a lot of these soldiers will march in support of the Bolsheviks. So having control, basically, of the military, or having gained the trust and the support of the military, the Bolsheviks can almost sort of present themselves as perhaps more influential than they are, and can certainly present themselves as sort of an intimidating political force. As I said, the Bolsheviks are the only party that has its own army. When the elections happened in the fall of 1917, there is a significant emphasis or a significant advantage that the Bolsheviks have among the army camps, or in the army camps. That is, if you look at the elections to the assembly held in the fall of 1917, this assembly that was going to frame a new constitution for Russia, a new legislative system for Russia, this is in the army. In the army, basically 67% vote for the Bolsheviks. That gives you an idea of just how strongly the Bolsheviks have made their case. There are two other types of socialists here. The Mensheviks barely get 1%, don't even get 1%. The socialist revolutionaries get about 20%, and then sort of more traditional sort of Russian monarchists get about 2%. But you have this, this enormous support in the army for the Bolsheviks. And it's not unplanned. It's entirely planned by Lenin. This is part of the strategy. If you look at another constituency, this is actually out in sort of the Russian heartland. There, you don't see a Bolshevik dominance. You do see the dominance, 80% here, of what are called the socialist revolutionaries. People who were socialists themselves, but who were much more gradualist, who weren't pledging, like Lenin was, to completely remake the Russian economy immediately, and at least some of whom, in the socialist revolutionary movement, wanted to continue the war with the Germans. In some places, you have the Russian Orthodox Church, which, though not entirely thrilled, was willing to support these more moderate socialists against the Bolsheviks. That is, the Bolsheviks knew, especially out in the countryside, they would not have as great a chance as they would among the army, or the population in the army. That is, in the countryside, traditional sort of deference, especially to the church, remained. And so if the church was going to favor one political side or another, it might still have a huge impact on how people voted. The deal is, though, in 1917, late 1917, no one gets a majority in this legislative assembly. But when it convenes at the start of 1918 in St. Petersburg, the Bolsheviks bring their army. They surround and dismiss the rest of the assembly, these other political parties, and the Bolsheviks take control. That is, you cannot, in essence, argue with an army. And that's what the Bolsheviks have done. So for Lenin, all this talk about bread, land, and peace, all this talk about participation in elections, is largely cover. It's the easiest way in which the Bolsheviks can get to power. It gives them cover for getting their message out, and it gives them particularly cover for gaining the support of the vast majority of the troops. Between and in the next couple of months, in early 1918, Lenin will, among other things, make a treaty and basically surrender to the Germans, and will give the Germans an enormous chunk of Western Russia, parts of what's now actually Poland, too. The Germans won't get it for long. 6 months later, the Germans surrender themselves, and this treaty is nullified. But it gives you an indication that Lenin is serious about ending the war. He was willing to end the war on terms very favorable to the Germans. One other reason that Lenin is so eager to end the war is that he knows, not only did he sort of make a promise to the soldiers that he has to keep, but he also knows he's going to need these soldiers to fight in an upcoming civil war. Between 1919 and 1921, you have a Russian civil war, in which those people, some of whom are members of other political parties, some of whom are still supporters of the aristocracy or the church and the Tsar, they will wage full-out war in Russia. And you start to see, during this conflict, a couple of the hallmarks of the Leninist approach, or a couple of examples of how Lenin is willing to do whatever it takes to achieve the success of his revolution. During the Russian Civil War, in fact, not even during, but in the lead up to it, one of the things that Lenin does is that Lenin institutes a huge program of political repression. All other political parties are outlawed. People seen as opponents of the Bolsheviks, even just political opponents, not sort of, violent opponents, are locked up. Under Lenin, you see the start of what's going to be known as the Gulag system in the Soviet Union, the system of prison labor camps to which politically undesirable people are sent. Gulag is G-U-L-A-G. That's the setting for the third book we'll be reading by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You have the creation of a new secret police. Now, the Bolsheviks don't invent the secret police. The Tsar had secret police. The Tsar had his own system. This is what's called the Gulag. The Tsar had his own secret police. And this is one of the ways in which, sort of the continuity between pre- and post-revolutionary Russia is apparent, I think. Lenin institutes a new sort of secret police, which is responsible for, again, policing political dissent, rounding up those who are seen as threats to the revolution. It's not the KGB. The KGB is going to largely be concerned with doing things outside of the Soviet Union. This is the police are first known, they get a bunch of acronyms as they go. The first one, when they're founded, is Cheka, C-H-E-K-A, Cheka, which basically means it's this very long, it's an acronym to cover this very long thing, roughly, it was a very long description that roughly says the organization or the institution for the prevention of bourgeois and capitalist vice and the promotion of Soviet virtue, something like that. So everybody called it the Cheka. So this is the first thing. You have secret police, and you have a prison system for political dissenters. In some ways resembling that which the Tsar had. You also have a practice introduced that's called war communism. War communism. Which basically says that the state can take whatever it wants in order to win this war. A lot of these guys who thought they were going to be demobilized after this Bolshevik takeover were actually found out that they were going to have to go fight. The opponents of the Russian Revolution, the people known as the White Army, would fight the Bolshevik Red Army. A lot of these guys won't be home for 2 more years. The government under Lenin seizes property, food, materials, anything it needs. The needs of the state, the needs of the new government are paramount. And you can see in there, again, this emphasis on the primacy of the state and the primacy of the needs of the state for Lenin. So the institution of secret police, the criminalization of political dissent, or the continued criminalization of political dissent, the introduction of what's called war communism. all give you an idea of what kind of revolution this is going to be. One largely led through above, one in which ends are much more important than means. Any questions so far? Once the Civil War is over, by 1921, Lenin decides it is time to give what's now called the Soviet Union some breathing space. And again, remember, Lenin is willing to be very flexible politically, even ideologically, because he has a certain goal in mind. How he gets to that goal doesn't really matter. In 1921, Lenin decides that the next step for this new Soviet Union is massive industrialization. That's how the plan was supposed to go. You have the revolution, you win that, then you start the industrialization. But he says, we're not ready for it yet. We can't industrialize. We don't have the food to feed enough people, especially if we want to move people into urban areas, to build factories, to live in cities. And we don't have the technology. We simply don't have the machinery and the expertise within the Soviet Union to carry this out. So what Lenin decides to do is he says to all those people who have seized land, all these peasants who are now taken over land during just after the revolution, he says, you can keep your land. And in fact, the state is going to pay a regular and assured price for things like grain, as long as you sell a certain percentage of your crop, maybe by half, maybe 3/4, to the state at a certain price, which is a pretty good price. You can sell the rest, actually, on an open market. That is just the Bolsheviks proposing this open market scheme, where you sell the government a certain part of what you've produced at a specific rate, and then you can sell the rest for whatever you can get for it. This is called Lenin's NEP, New Economic Policy, the NEP. And it's not because Lenin has overnight converted to the idea of small-scale capitalism. It's that Lenin sees this as the only way to get Russian agriculture going again. Get people back on the land, get them using whatever means is necessary to grow crops. The real reason that Lenin institutes this and wants to get productivity going is that the Soviet Union needs to sell a ton of grain to the rest of the world. They need to sell a ton of grain to the rest of the world to earn foreign currency, to earn British pounds or American dollars. Because they can then use that hard currency, that currency that's recognized around the world, rather than the very shaky Soviet ruble, which is just the beginning. They can use that hard currency to go buy the equipment and the material and the expertise they need to industrialize. That is, the new economic policy is designed to get productivity back in agriculture, but productivity so that you can then move on to the next step of mass industrialization. Lenin doesn't lay out how long it's going to last, but he does institute this NEP. Again, as a way of gaining cash for the Soviet state. So the Soviets can go out and buy everything from railway equipment to hiring engineers and consultants and builders and others to come from around the world to help ultimately industrialize the Soviet Union. It's another example of his willingness to be flexible and his readiness to be flexible in the name of his long-term ends or long-term goal. Any questions about this? Okay. The new economic policy is up and running by 1922-23. Lenin himself dies in 1924. And famously, Lenin made, or on several occasions, Lenin famously talked about who ought to succeed him. At one point, a couple of years before he died, Lenin was convinced that perhaps his successor would not be Trotsky, but that his best successor might be this guy, Joseph Stalin. Lenin changed his mind, apparently, right before he died. And according to some, among the last things that Lenin ever spoke were the words, "anyone but Stalin."
Don't trust Stalin.
Sorry, don't trust Stalin. Yeah, he didn't like Stalin's propensity for violence. He thought Stalin was a little bit too sort of impetuous. Stalin had always been prized. Joseph Stalin had been prized by the Bolsheviks because of his commitment to the cause and his willingness to be ruthless, to use violence, to find out informers and dissenters. Stalin himself is a very sort of odd character within the Bolshevik elite. Most of the Bolsheviks around Lenin and around Trotsky are from urban areas. They're ethnically Russian. They speak Russian. They've been educated. Stalin's not like that. Stalin comes from Georgia, down on the Black Sea. Stalin is basically seen as having come from the sticks. Stalin had embraced revolutionary ideas within Russia very early in the 20th century. Stalin had been arrested, both for that activity and for all sorts of other, sort of criminal behavior in Georgia by his teens. His parents, in sort of last-ditch effort to change the course of his life, had sent him to a Russian Orthodox seminary. The seminary ultimately produced more hardcore Bolsheviks than it did Russian Orthodox priests. So exactly what happened in that seminary is everyone's guess. But Stalin eventually kicked out. Stalin's in prison. Stalin spends time in a labor camp in Siberia. But when the revolution comes, Stalin rushes to it. And his energies and his willingness to sort of basically be ruthless are very prized. And he works his way up the hierarchy of the Bolshevik Party by making himself necessary, making himself basically sort of required, in helping organize the secret police, helping identify dissenters and political opponents in particular. But Stalin is still seen as sort of rough around the edges. The other Bolsheviks will at the time make fun of Stalin. Stalin changed his name. He was not born Joseph Stalin. His last name was actually Djugashvili. Don't worry about that. But he changed to Stalin because Stalin means hard, like iron or steel. In fact, all of these guys, Trotsky, I can't remember Trotsky, both Trotsky and Lenin changed their names too. Again, to sort of shorten them up and give them a little more, you might say, sort of punch. Stalin, in 1924, when Lenin dies, Stalin has already prepared a strategy for how he's going to succeed Lenin, not Trotsky. And it has several elements in it. In the first place, Stalin calls in a lot of favors that he's done for other people in the Bolshevik regime. Stalin, in essence, threatens violence. Stalin's supporters are known to be very sort of loose cannons. Stalin also makes a very important argument, though. Stalin says, we have to continue what Lenin has done, which is establish what Stalin calls socialism in one country. That's Stalin's important phrase. Socialism in one country. In essence, get the entire process done here first. Trotsky, Stalin's main opponent, had a different idea. Trotsky thought that you weren't going to be able to get fully to an industrial and socialist Soviet Union unless you had more help from the outside world. Not just, help that you could purchase in terms of technology, but actual ideological support. Trotsky is in favor of what might be called internationalizing or globalizing this revolution, of using the Soviet state to promote and to foment and to energize movements similar to the Bolshevik ones in Europe and elsewhere around the world. That by creating this sort of group of like-minded states, then the Soviet Union would have partners would have support and would be able to industrialize very quickly. Stalin's argument wins out. Stalin says, we need to finish this work. This is what Lenin wanted. And it seems to, in fact, have been what Lenin wanted. And Stalin wins. Some of Stalin's followers also make or also call attention to the fact that Trotsky is Jewish. Remember, Stalin is Georgian. He's not ethnic Russian. So he's sort of outside the circle of elites in the Bolshevik Party. One way in which he can insert himself into that circle of elites is to argue that it now doesn't matter who's a better Russian, but to argue in essence that Jews will not make good Soviet citizens. And that Trotsky as a Jew cannot be fully trusted. That is, it's a way of eliminating this obstacle which Stalin feels he has, this obstacle which is his own outsider status, by saying, if I'm an outsider, Trotsky's an even greater outsider. And so some of Stalin's supporters mumble, rumor things around that say that Trotsky's concerned more about the outside world than he is about the Soviet state. That he's interested in sort of making connections with other Jewish Bolshevik communities abroad than he is with building up the Bolshevik state at home. So Trotsky loses. By 1927, Trotsky is under arrest internally and sent to an internal exile within the Soviet Union. By 1929, he leaves the Soviet Union. Ultimately winds up in Mexico City, where in 1940 he's assassinated by two people working for Stalin, who bludgeon him to death with an axe. You can see Trotsky, if you've ever seen, there was a movie made, it was a long time ago, but the artist Frida Kahlo. Has anyone ever seen that? Frida Kahlo, the Mexican artist. Sorry? Yeah, she had a relationship with a man named Diego Rivera, the artist, muralist. And they were in Mexico City in the 1930s, and there's a couple of scenes in which Trotsky's there too, because that's where Trotsky wound up, Mexico City. And where he's ultimately assassinated in 1940. Trotsky, I think in some senses, Trotsky's reputation has benefited from the fact that he didn't actually take over. I think I mentioned last time, one of the great ways to enhance your historical reputation is just basically don't be Hitler. Another way related to that is don't be Stalin. Trotsky has the great fortune of not having been Stalin. And he was a critic of Stalin's in the 1930s. Trotsky himself was not Gandhi. This is not a non-violent, sort of peaceable-minded man. Trotsky was a wholehearted supporter of violence in putting the Red Army together to fight in 1919. He supported the vigorous repression of political opponents. Trotsky's not nonviolent. He's also likely would not have been as murderous and as almost sort of genocidal as Stalin proved to be, but one never knows. Trotsky was never actually given the reins of power. Stalin was. And the results are, on the one sense, enormously impressive if you don't think about everything that's going on underneath. On the one hand, they are impressive. What Stalin managed to do with the Soviet Union between 1925 and 1939 is astounding. Convinces some people around the world that the Stalinist model of economic development is the way forward. But at a time of economic depression, Stalin is now showing the way. Many of those people who think that don't really understand the dynamics of what Stalin's doing. Nor do they understand this is the man who said that a single murder is a tragedy, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. Stalin takes over in 1925. He got Trotsky out of the Soviet Union by 1929, and in 1929 he introduces the first. Before I even say it, let me go back. I want to show this image of Stalin. Beloved Stalin, good fortune of the people, everyone clapping and cheering for Stalin. Stalin's poster is here, Lenin is here. They're equals in this picture. Everything in this is planned out, by the way. All of this Soviet propaganda of the 20s and 30s is some of the most sophisticated propaganda you will ever see. And how it sets up people, how it portrays them, how it tries to frame them. We'll talk about some of it. I've got some great examples here as we go along. This is a sort of fairly standard Stalin as sort of the benevolent leader, good fortune of the people. Stalin was nobody. They knew that they couldn't get away with presenting Stalin as everyone's grandfather or father. You know, Stalin didn't have any charm. Stalin didn't have a lot of personal warmth. That's putting it mildly. But they settled ultimately on this idea of Stalin as everyone's sort of gruff and sort of cranky, but ultimately well-meaning uncle. That is, you know, Stalin was he was rough around the edges. He was provincial, you know. Yeah, some people get killed. That's Stalin. What are you going to do? You know, a million here, a million there. The reason you're talking about most of the Ukraine. The thing about this presentation is it sort of kept the notion of Stalin as this sort of violent person, as someone with a propensity to violence, but ultimately argued he was doing it in the aid of the Soviet people. So he's an uncle. He's a person, you know, he's in the family, everyone loves him. He's maybe not the most sophisticated guy, but he's very effective at what he does. He means well, exactly. He means well. If you're in trouble, you can call Uncle Joe. Which is what Franklin Roosevelt called him. Franklin Roosevelt called him Uncle Joe. I don't know if he ever did to his face, but that would have been worthwhile. But this is the image. And the important thing is this. Stalin puts an enormous amount of time and energy into projecting this image. And it's the projection of this image that will allow him to do a lot of things that to us seem horrifying. And in fact, actually to anyone, are horrifying. And get away with it. That is, one of the things that Stalin creates is he creates an enormous mechanism, and an enormous sort of institutionalized sort of propaganda, whereby his image is everywhere, and this certain image of him is everywhere. The other thing is this, it's not just the imagery. Stalin is also able, in the late 1930s, is able to say to many people in the Soviet Union, you are now better off than you were. And in fact, they will be. That is, lots of people who are poor peasants in 1925 are, if not, you know, wealthy or even comfortable, they are better cared for, better fed, better housed, and better educated, working in new industrial cities. That is, if you did not get yourself hauled off to the Gulag, or executed, or exiled under Stalin, so if you're not one of the sort of 11 to 12 million people to whom that happened in the 1920s and 30s, then, in many cases, Stalin was good. There are fewer people like this in Russia today, but there are still a few who will come out to Red Square in Moscow, for example, and have little demonstrations every year on Stalin's birthday and say, we need Stalin back. Stalin, to them, represents the high point of their history. And you can't get them to admit anything bad about Stalin, because they didn't personally know anything bad about Stalin. The other thing is this, is that Stalin is, by virtue of the success of the economic plans he puts in place, and the success of the propaganda and educational efforts that he and the Soviet elite engage in, they are able to produce a population which by the end of the 1930s not only in many ways embraces Stalin, but is willing to do just about anything for Stalin and the state. That is one of the sort of historical mysteries about the Soviet Union, or at least historical questions, is why were so many people, why were so many Soviets between 1940 and 1945 willing to die for Stalin, willing to die for this regime that had done so much damage within the Soviet Union? And there are several answers. One, people didn't quite recognize it. The second is that, you know, when the Nazis arrive, you know, it doesn't matter, you know, who you're fighting for. Winston Churchill famously said, you know, that, you know, if the devil came out against Hitler, he said, I would at least make a favorable reference to him in the House of Parliament, or in the House of Commons in Parliament. You know, anyone willing to take on Hitler. Was seen as, ultimately an ally to the cause. And so that, Stalin was not Hitler. The third thing, though, is this, and I think this is most important. This is something that historians of the Soviet Union pointed out, especially recently, as a lot of archival material has come out since the fall of the Soviet Union. They said, the Soviets are very, very effective in the 20s and 30s in producing a population which sees duty to the state and duty to Stalin, by extension, as the most important thing in their life. That is, the propaganda effort combined with the efforts at improving the lives of people, improving the lives of the ordinary ethnic Russians in particular, creates this unbelievable willingness to sacrifice by the time war comes. That is, the Soviet people are able to put up with all sorts of deprivation, are able to make all sorts of personal sacrifices, economic sacrifices, physical sacrifices, because they have bought into Stalin and they have bought into the notion that sacrifice is the sort of highest moral duty that they have. You'll see pictures, I don't think I have a picture of this one, but I mean, during the war, when just about every animal, every pack animal, every animal that could be used for transport, had been requisitioned by the Soviet government, Soviet farms kept producing goods. Oftentimes, you would see, and there are famous pictures from like Life magazine, of basically Soviet women in harnesses pulling plows through the fields. Something dramatic happens in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s that convinces people, you know what, I'm going to go out there and I'll put on a harness. Like a draft horse. Or like a team of oxen. And pull a plow through a field. It's not just the sort of instinct to survive or the will to survive. There's some other sort of willingness to sacrifice that gets inculcated, that gets built into people in the 20s and 30s. And it's never repeated. That is, people who will come up in the Soviet system later never get the full dose or the full sort of, never feel the full sort of effect of all of this Bolshevik effort to legitimize themselves and to build up the state as those who come of age between about 1920 and 1935 do. Those are the ones who are going to help basically build the Soviet Union. Those are the ones who are going to help save the Soviet Union from the Germans in the 1940s. So we look at this propaganda effort as it's not simply about protecting Stalin, but it's about building up in the Soviet people very effectively a willingness to do anything for Stalin. So Stalin wants to start this socialism in one country. He wants to start massive industrialization. And he's going to succeed. By 1939, the Soviet Union is the third largest industrial power in the world.
By what year?
By 1939. Trailing only, if I remember correctly, Germany and the United States. Or the United States and Germany. In terms of industrial capacity, what they can put out and the value of what they put out. It is a massive transformation of Russian infrastructure. They build roads and railway networks. The Soviets built dams and power plants. They build entire cities, basically in the middle of nowhere, because that's where the iron ore is. Or that's where the copper is, or that's where the coal is. A lot of cities to the east of Moscow had barely any inhabitants, or tiny villages in 1920. By 1940, some of these places have 500,000 people living. People who are not only working in the factories, but people who have actually built the factories and built the housing in which they live around the factories. You've got several million people in a gulag system of forced labor. This is the thing about the Soviet system, is that it's not simply about getting ordinary people mobilized to build infrastructure, to build cities. But because the Soviet system criminalizes so much, criminalizes thought and disagreement and dissension, the Soviet gulag is this, you might say, sort of labor reserve, or specific labor power. That is, in order to industrialize, you've also got to do some unbelievably dirty jobs and some unbelievably tough jobs. It might have been tough to convince even Soviet peasants to take them on. But if you put it as the job of labor camp inmates, then it's done. That is the necessity to clear forests, to put in railway lines, to dig irrigation ditches and other things to build dams. In the 1930s, the Soviets discover that they have a lot of gold up above the Arctic Circle. And they start using Gulag labor there, shipping people through the North Pacific up into the Arctic Ocean and then to mine gold. In fact, in the late 1930s, there's an incident where 3 Soviet Gulag ships, basically jammed with prisoners, they get trapped in ice in the Pacific, fairly close to Alaska, near the Aleutian Islands. And the American Navy, commercial fishermen, they all say, we'll come help you, we'll break the ice. We'll come and so he said, no, absolutely not. No one can come. We will get there. And it's this huge sort of diplomatic thing. They don't want anyone near their ships because they don't want anyone to know it's exactly on the ships, which are thousands of emaciated and starving prisoners who are being shipped to mine gold. Because once you've got gold, then you can buy anything you want in the world. You can stop shipping grain around the world. You just use the gold. But mining for gold above the Arctic Circle is the kind of thing reserved for people in Gulag. When the Soviet Navy finally gets out to these ships, they find that most of the people on all of the ships are dead, including the crew, except on one ship where they've all apparently gone insane. And they had been eating the, shall we say, future gold miners of the Soviet Union to stay alive. But you could see why the Soviets wanted no one anywhere near these ships.
How long were they trapped in?
They were trapped for about 6 weeks, maybe 2 months, in fact. Long enough, apparently, for all sorts of things to go wrong. And it was the kind of thing where, again, the Soviet government was absolutely unwilling to let anyone else in the world see what was going on. This massive economic transformation begins in 1929, or excuse me, 1928, with the first of what Stalin will call the first 5-year plan of Stalin's regime. It's a hallmark of these sort of regimes that they tend to put out things called 5-year plans. Usually it means that it's going to take longer than 5 years and no one really has a plan. But in this case, it's actually true. It takes them 2 5-year plans, but they do actually have a plan. And sort of like anything called the People's Democratic Republic of X is none of the above. Okay? The economic transformation that Stalin has in mind requires a major shift in how Soviet people live. It's going to require, in particular, the movement of lots of people off of the land and into cities to work. That is, you've got to figure out how you're going to move all these people to mine, to build, to labor in these new factory cities, these new mining towns and communities. How are you going to do that? You're going to basically, and a lot of people are going to be willing to go. That is, a lot of Russian peasants especially, and poor, you might say generally poor Soviet peasants who did not seize any land, did not have any resources in the 20s and early 1930s from before the revolution. They are quite willing to pack up and go. But the question is, how are you going to feed them? How are you going to continue to export a lot of grain? How are you going to make that, therefore, agriculture continually more productive, export a lot of grain, and feed all these people in the cities? Without all of that labor in the countryside. You're moving all the labor to the cities. And the answer that Stalin has, that's part of the larger Soviet plan, the larger Bolshevik plan, is what's called collectivization. Collectivization. Basically, you're going to put agriculture, or structure agriculture around collective farms. collective farms, which will use the greatest technology that anyone in the 1920s has ever seen, the tractor, in order to maximize productivity and minimize the amount of labor required. You're going to take the land, divide it into sort of million-acre or more parcels, call them each a collective farm. You'll have some people who will continue to live and work on these collective farms, but using all sorts of new innovations, tractors, combines, harvesters, an extensive railway network, they will be able to do the work of the many, freeing up the rest of the population that might be required to produce food and moving them to the cities. So again, the tractor, you cannot underestimate the significance of the tractor. The tractor is the first thing that Lenin wants people to buy, or that Lenin wants the state to buy in the early 1920s. And make sure tractors get out to these farmers producing grain. I had a professor in college who used to say that every Soviet movie made in the early 1930s had the same plot, which was boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, boy meets tractor. Boy falls in love with tractor and runs away with tractor to collective farm for good of greater Soviet state. And, you know, he said it get repetitive after a while, but people seem to like it. Well, there's the only showing how. The tractor is going to be the key. One of the first major factories built in the early 1930s is going to be a huge tractor factory out in a place called Chelyabinsk in central Russia. So you have, again, this idea that collective farms will produce goods and free up labor. We will start next time talking about how exactly you're going to collectivize and why it appears that the tractor is actually running people over. All right, that is enough for today, and I will see you all next time.
Did you just record today?
Yep. I did record. If people are looking, I did record last week's